I'm Owen Bigland. This is the Inside Edge video blog. Okay, in this blog I'm going to talk about what's known as the crossover point. And if you read my book, Along for the Ride, in the opening chapter, I talk about me achieving my crossover point. That's why I call this book Along for the Ride. It's not only about buying real estate, buying your principal residence, buying some investment properties, getting your retirement funds, money into retirement through equities. But more importantly, it's about investing in things like real estate and stocks that will pay you to hold them, either, of course, in the form of the rent checks from your tenants, or in the form of the quarterly, or in some cases, the monthly dividend that your equities will produce for you. It'll pay you to hold them. And that is 100% passive income. The income that you're earning from my real estate portfolio isn't 100% passive. It can go years being passive, but eventually I've got to get a new tenant, or I've got to fix the toilet, or put a new dishwasher in, and put a little bit of work. But for the most part, it's fairly passive. People would be surprised, especially if you're buying younger condos that don't require a lot of work. Keep the appliances up. You're usually going to be okay there for many years. Not a lot of work. But my stock portfolio and the dividends I get from that is 100% passive. I just collect them every quarter. I've got some ETFs that pay me every month to holding them. They send me a check or wire it to my bank, to my brokerage account. But the crossover point is what all of you guys should strive for, and what I call bulletproofing your retirement, especially moving forward here with inflation running at where it's at. Now, we've been lucky here the last 15 or 20 years. We've lived in a pretty low inflation environment here, especially for the last 10 years. Now, that might change. I mean, right now, inflation is running pretty hot. The numbers just came out a couple days ago. You know, it's running at something like 6.5% right now in the States. Now, keep in mind, though, take that with a bit of a grain of salt here. I do think we've got to give this another 6 months to a year. I do think some of this is transitory with supply chain and COVID. The other thing is there's another metric that they use at where they back out the cost of gas and cars, and that makes up a huge jump in the inflation rate, and that pegs it more like around 4%, which is probably a little more realistic. But regardless, we are going to be heading into probably a higher rate of inflation here going forward, with all the money the Fed and the Canadian government has printed to get us out of COVID. But that is the magic of why you want to be getting into assets and investing in equities and real estate that will pay you to hold them. And it's about achieving that crossover point. So if you read my book, in the opening chapter, I talk about that magical time in February of 2013 when I was doing my income taxes. And that's when I added up the income coming from all my stock portfolio. And, you know, I'll be honest with you guys, it's, you know, well in excess of, you know, multi-million-dollar portfolio back then I had, that I started from nothing, much larger now. And then my real estate holdings. And I had, and I still do have, you know, quite a few rental properties. A lot of people ask me, how many exactly do you own? And I'm not going to say. Let's call it this. It's more than 4, less than 10. But that was the magical moment where I took all the dividend payments that were paid to me through my TD Waterhouse account and my Royal Bank Direct. They total it all up for you in a nice spreadsheet. And then the rent income that I had minus my expenses. So in some of my mortgages, I had clear title. So, you know, with a lot of cash flow. Others, you know, you taking in $2,400 a month, but you might have $1,000 in interest payments and maintenance fees and property taxes and things like that. That's the nice thing about owning real estate. In the first years, you're not going to get a whole lot of cash flow, if any, but as you slowly move along into year 10 and year 15, it'll start to build more cash flow for you. So that magical point in February 2013, and I knew I had been on track for this for a lot of years prior to that. I was in my early to mid 40s where I hit that magical crossover point. I had a number in my head that I had always set, or at least had set for quite a few years prior to that, that I would need to be able to retire and still live comfortably off my passive income. And I can tell you that wasn't, I aimed high. It was well into 6 figures I wanted, because I wouldn't want to retire on anything less than that. I still wanted to drive a nice car, spend 6, 7, 8 weeks on vacation, spend my winters in Hawaii or California. be able to go out and eat steak and all that other good stuff, train at a good fitness center, have a trainer and all that. So that was the point in 2013 where I hit that crossover point, where if I chose to, I could easily stop my work as a realtor and comfortably, more than comfortably, just live on the passive income flows. So let me just give you a quick idea of what we're talking about here. Let's take a $1 million stock portfolio. You've got $1 million in there, and you've got that held in a wide variety of companies: Bell Canada, TD Bank, Royal Bank, Enbridge, Suncor, and then in the U.S. you've got maybe Philip Morris, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, Visa, Home Depot, Costco, Pfizer, and then you've got a bunch of ETFs, Triple Q, the XIC, the XEI, the VIG, those kind of things. Now, some of those holdings, individual holdings like a Bell Canada, is going to pay you 5.5% yield. If you were buying it last year, you would have locked in something close to a 7. A Philip Morris might be paying you 6%. And then you've got Apples that are paying you less than 1% dividend. You've got a whole bunch of stuff like Macdonald's and Johnson & Johnson that are paying you about 3% is the dividend yield. But when you add it all up, the high pairs and the lower ones like Visa and Home Depot, which aren't even paying you 1%, let's say you're averaging about a 3.5% yield on your $1 million portfolio. So that means that every year you're going to receive $35,000 in dividends passively. Every quarter they're going to send you a check for what do we call it here? Let's call it $8,000 every 3 months. If you have a $2 million portfolio, they're going to send you $70,000. Here's the thing that's what I call bulletproofing your portfolio, and what you guys should strive for, and what I talk about it in my book. The big fear now, and the biggest fear for everybody retiring, especially when you start getting into a high inflation environment, is running out of money when you retire. Because most people have to do the 4% drawdown type thing, where they build $1 million portfolio and they have to cash in 4% or 4% of their portfolio every year to live on. That's a tough way to go, because stock markets go up and down. You could get a 40 or 50% correction very quickly that takes that $1 million portfolio down to $500,000. Now you're drawing down 4%. Well, now you're going to have to draw down 8% to achieve what you had when it was $1 million. It's tough. Now, some of that might be made up with dividends, but having to draw down a portfolio is not a place where you really want to be, although that's where most Canadians and Americans are. The better way to go is to bulletproof your retirement. Build a big enough portfolio, and I know it's not easy to do. You're talking a $2 million, $3 million portfolio. Well, when you're dreaming, it can be done, but it all depends on where you're living. Some people, if you're living in Vancouver, retiring on $100,000 or $150,000, yeah, it'll give you a decent retirement, but nothing to write home about, especially in a city like Los Angeles or New York. If you're living in Winnipeg, hey, $60,000 or $70,000 might get you a pretty decent retirement there. So it all depends on your needs, where you're living, cost of living, and all that stuff. But the nice thing about having a portfolio that is producing $35,000 a year in dividends is that those companies, the vast majority of the companies I hold, are not only paying the dividend, and some don't pay a dividend. I've got Google, I've got Netflix, Nvidia, I've got some tech names that pay me no dividend. They're on the growth side. But the ones that are paying me, the majority of those are what we call dividend growers. They're going to increase that dividend. The Canadian banks are all like that. Johnson & Johnson, the pharma companies, Apple, they are all increasing their dividends, and in a lot of cases by double digits. Give you some examples. Visa just increased their dividend. I tweet out a lot of this stuff on my Twitter feed. Visa just increased their dividend by 17%. Home Depot, Johnson & Johnson. The Canadian banks here moving forward, now that they've got that moratorium lifted on them, they're probably going to be increasing their dividends here 15-20% moving forward. Suncor last month just increased their dividend 100%. They doubled it. Now, overall, I run spreadsheets on this. My overall, from about the 30 companies that I hold plus my ETFs, I'm averaging about a 7.5-8% dividend growth rate. Some increase it much higher, some lower. And then I've got a lot of companies that don't pay a dividend. But I'm averaging about a 7.5%, 8% dividend growth rate. So if I get $35,000 this year off a $1 million portfolio, I'm probably going to get $38,000 next year. And that's without putting any more money into it. That's just on the dividend growth. So you see, what that's doing is that if inflation's running at 4% or 5%, and you're getting a dividend growth rate of 7, 8, or 9% on average, you're more than doubling what the inflation rate is. And that's where you want to be. You bulletproof your retirement there. Now you don't have to sell stock if you don't want to. You can just live off the dividends, and even better, those dividends are insulated against inflation by twofold because they're growing those dividends. These are the things that I want you guys to learn about. I talk about this in my book. That's why I plugged the book here. That's why I wrote it as a door opener, to give you an introduction to what I'm talking about here, because so many people don't understand dividends, or that they are increased every year for most of these companies, and what to look for with companies that pay a dividend. One of the things you want to look at with a company is what the payout ratio is. That's easy to find out. The lower that ratio, the more room you have for dividend increases. For instance, Apple right now, they've been growing their dividend at double-digit rates here. The payout ratio with Apple is something like 30%, meaning that that's what they're paying out after net profits in the form of the dividend. So the old rule of thumb is anything under 60 has got room to grow still. If a company's paying 90% of their net earnings in the form of a dividend, you're probably not going to get a lot of growth on the dividend there. But those are little things that I won't get into on here that you've got to learn about. Just the basics about dividend payout ratios and what to look for in a company. What is the track record of their dividend increases? And where that payout ratio is, because that'll tell you a story. How much of the net profits are going towards covering that dividend, and do they have room to keep increasing it? The vast majority of the companies I own, with a few exceptions, like a tobacco, like a Philip Morris, most of their net profits are paid out to the shareholders. There's not a lot of room for growth there. But that's the way these tobacco companies are. They're old, they can't advertise, the growth is limited on those, but they pay a nice dividend. The only thing is it's not going to grow very much. So you might want to mix a few of those. They counteract each other. It's that barbell approach I talk about. But you see, this is where you want to be. You build a $2 million portfolio, that's going to produce $70,000 for you next year without lifting a finger. And the following year, it's going to go from $75,000 to probably $82,000, more than indexed against inflation. Now you get into your 40s, you might have a couple of investment properties you bought 10 years prior. Now you might be taking in another, after expenses, another $1,500 or $2,000 a month from that. There's another $24,000. Now, before you know it, you're in your mid-40s and you've got $100,000 coming in completely passive. It's not going to be easy. Everyone is different. Some people building a $800,000 stock portfolio will be more than enough for what you're going to need in the city you live in. There's no, the sky is the limit with this. You set your limitations or your limits wherever you want and what kind of lifestyle you want to build. That's where it all comes down to. What type of lifestyle you want to provide. For me, I'm still working. I could easily have retired 10 years ago and lived off this, but I love the work that I do. I like to stay engaged. I like to stay busy and mentally stimulated. But one of these days, in the next 3 or 4 years, I'll probably start sending more stuff off to my team, which I already am doing now more of already. And I'll gradually start to, limit my hours a bit. But the nice thing about the portfolio I built and you guys can build is, it's a huge, weight off. Financial stress is the biggest stress most people face. And when you can hit that crossover point, it's a magical time. Now you're not at the whim of your boss or your work, or if you want to take a month off and go on a cruise or travel Europe, you can do that. Again, when I eventually do fully retire, let's call it at 65, I've got more than enough that I'm going to need to coming in passively from my stock portfolio and my stocks. But hey, if I decide to buy a new Porsche or travel around the world on a luxury cruise for 2 months, I can do that. I might just sell $25,000 worth of stock. It's not even going to put a dent. But that's what you want to do. Try and supercharge. Aim high is what I did. And even if you fall a little lower than what you did, you're probably going to end up better than if you set the bar too low. That's what I was always told when I was growing up. Set the bar high. And the funny thing is, as you go along into your 20s and 30s, when you're in your 20s, you think, hey, $1 million portfolio would be mind-boggling. But as you go along, the goalposts will change. As you start earning more money and get better in your career and you're buying assets and your stock portfolio is going up, that bar continues to go up and up. That's something that's a little dangerous too. I won't get into that. Some people, it's never enough, and you don't want to be like that. You should set a number that, you've got to enjoy your life, and I've been a big believer in that too. It's not all about work, and it's not all about money. Get into something you enjoy. Enjoy the ride. That's why I call it along for the ride. Enjoy the process of building that up. But eventually you'll get to a point where you'll hit that crossover point, and that'll be it. Retire full-time and just live off those passive income. And that is a really nice place to be. It is. I'm Owen Bigland. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.